Hello everybody and welcome to the Derek Ruby Show. I am your host of previously mentioned Mr. Ruby. Professional wrestling. It is the personification of an athletic contest mixed with entertainment. Or the phrase coined by Vince McMahon, sports entertainment. However, there is one thing that every wrestler of any merit strives to be, and that is the World Heavyweight Champion. The World Heavyweight Championship is to wrestling like being the Academy Award winner to an actor. Now, when people think of world champions, they think of legends like Hulk Hogan, Bruno Sammartino, Lou Thesz, Ric Flair, Harley Race, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, John Cena, as well as countless others. Now, there have been many world championships in various promotions throughout the years, such as the AWA, ECW, TNA, Ring of Honor, or even the IWGP Heavyweight Championship for New Japan. And New Japan has been around a lot longer than the other ones mentioned, and the IWGP Championship does hold a certain level of prestige and prominence. I'm not trying to disparage any of these championships, but none of them are considered mainstream that an international audience would actually know and recognize them. Now, what I consider a world champion is a mainstream champion that the world would know, such as the WWE Championship, formerly known as the WWF or WWF Championship, the WWE version of the world title, the WWE Universal title, the NWA title to the point that it was no longer part of WCW in the early 90s, the WCW Championship, as well as the WCW International Championship, which is the equivalent of the Universal title today. If you held one of those belts, you were a mainstream world champion. But sometimes there are wrestlers that for whatever reason, whether they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, had personal problems, or just were unlucky and a victim of circumstance, or perhaps were injured and their career was cut short, they just never got that shot to be the world champion. So this is my personal list of the top 13 wrestlers that should have been a world heavyweight champion. Number 13, the Enforcer, Arn Anderson. Now, Arn Anderson is probably the most famous for being the enforcer of the Four Horsemen. But Anderson was an accomplished single star in his own right, having been the world television champion 4 times. But he was even a more accomplished tag team wrestler, having won the NWA and WCW tag team championships with multiple partners, such as Ole Anderson, Beautiful Bobby Eaton, the living legend Larry Zbyszko, Paul Roma, and probably most famously with Tully Blanchard, which together they won the NWA Tag Team titles, and they also went to the WWF and won the World Wrestling Federation Tag Team Championships. AA had some of the best basic ring fundamentals that any wrestler could hope to have. He was a brutal, ruthless, nasty heel, who could incense the crowd and make them hate him in the drop of a dime. When it comes to the ring psychology, there are few that could match Arn Anderson. His promo skills were second to none. No matter if you believed wrestling was real or fake, it didn't matter because Arn Anderson had the ability to make you believe that he was real. To paraphrase Tony Schiavone from his What Happened When podcast, if Arn Anderson had came up in the 70s or the early 80s, he no doubt would have been a world champion traveling from territory to territory, not only making people believe in him, but making people hate him as well. As great as Arn was on the mic and as great as he was in the ring, his misfortune was being with people that were just as great if not better, because he was in the Four Horsemen with the likes of Ric Flair, with Tully Blanchard, he worked with Dusty Rhodes, he worked with Sting, he worked with Luger, he worked with Ricky Steamboat, Barry Windham. Arn was around all the top stars, and I believe he was just overshadowed in the era he came up in. It's partially because Arn Anderson looked like the average guy. He didn't look like a Lex Luger. He could work with a big guy like a Lex Luger, though. He could work with a small guy like a Ricky Morton. Arn could work with anybody, and he was really instrumental in the Horsemen and being the backbone of that group and keeping it together. Unfortunately, due to extensive neck and upper back injuries, Arn was forced to retire early and his career was cut short. He would then go on to be an agent in WCW, and he's still an agent today in WWE. Arn was so respected by his peers that he even once got a victory over Hulk Hogan on an episode of Nitro. And I can tell you this much, Hulk Hogan didn't do jobs for just anybody. One of Arn's major last appearances was at WrestleMania 18 during the Undertaker vs. Ric Flair match, in which he delivered a spinebuster to the Undertaker to a thunderous crowd ovation, which he so rightfully deserved. I'm not a wrestling expert, but if there are any aspiring wrestlers out there, you should spend time studying tapes of Arn Anderson and you'll probably be 10 times better than you were before. He is often spoken about as one of the greatest wrestlers who never was a world champion, and I wholeheartedly agree, and that's why Arn Anderson makes the list.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 12, the King of Hearts, Owen Hart. Owen Hart started his career in wrestling under his father, Stu Hart. His first run in the WWF was as the Blue Blazer, but it wasn't until his second run that Owen made a big splash. After turning heel on his brother Bret, he started a blood feud that lasted for a few years. He even defeated Bret for the WWF Championship, but the decision was overturned. Many people feel during this time period that they should have pulled the trigger and made Owen the champion. Owen worked with many notable stars such as his brother Bret, the British Bulldogs, Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, as well as countless others. Owen won many championships over his career such as the Intercontinental title, the WWF Tag Team Championship on numerous occasions, as well as the European Championship. Owen understood ring psychology and he was a very good technical wrestler. He was even capable of pulling off certain aerial maneuvers, and I would argue in some instances he may have even been better than his brother Bret. If nothing else, he could cut a better promo than his brother, and Bret is considered to be one of the greatest of all time by many. With these masterful promo skills, his in-ring ability, and his overall psychology, Owen Hart was a complete package. He even feuded with Triple H a lot on his way up to the top. Owen was the co-leader of the Nation of Domination. He also started going by the King of Hearts when he won the King of the Ring tournament, and he pretty much was able to make any situation that they gave him work. Now, Owen really wasn't a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He didn't have any drug hang-ups. He may have been an occasional ribber, but nobody had a problem with his in-ring work or skills. Unfortunately, on May 23rd, 1999, at the Over the Edge pay-per-view, there was an accident and it cost Owen Hart his life. Had that accident not happened, I'm pretty sure Owen would have continued to make a great opponent for the likes of Triple H, Steve Austin, and The Rock. And if there was one thing missing from the Attitude Era after the Montreal Screwjob, it was the lack of a heart in the World Wrestling Federation. And if Owen had been around, he would have filled that gap, and he would have made an excellent world champion. Everything he did was graceful, and it's very hard to find a quality wrestler that makes things look so easy like Owen did. It's really hard to think about what might have been, and I am one of them people that do believe that they should have pulled the trigger on Owen early on during his feud with Bret. Unfortunately, we will never know how this would have played out. If Owen would have not got the World Championship if he had lived, he probably would rank much higher on this list.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 11, Raven. Scott Levy, formerly known as Scotty the Body, Scotty Flamingo, and Johnny Polo, emerged as a Raven character in the mid-90s in ECW. Playing what I would call an internally tortured character, Raven used psychological tactics against his opponents. He had a group of flunkies known as the Raven's Nest, and he was able to get a feud out of Tommy Dreamer for several years. People have often said that Raven has one of the most creative minds in the business, and his understanding of psychology is better than most. In ECW, there were no rules. It was mainly hardcore action. But while other guys in ECW were beating each other with 20 chair shots, Raven would often opt to use only one chair shot and make it count where it meant the most. He held numerous championships throughout his time in ECW and was the ECW Heavyweight Champion during their first pay-per-view, Barely Legal. Not too long after dropping the belt, Raven emerged in WCW, where he replicated the success of the Raven's Nest with Raven's Flock. He feuded with notable opponents such as Chris Benoit and DDP, who both went on to be world champion, but for whatever reason, Raven was never given that opportunity. He did, however, hold the WCW Tag Team titles with Perry Saturn, and he became a transitional U.S. champion from DDP to Goldberg. While DDP was the world champion, Raven had several title shots on television against DDP on Thunder. He was basically positioned in the upper mid-card to lower main event status. But Raven wasn't happy with his position, and when he got the opportunity, he walked out of WCW. Then he came back to ECW for a cup of coffee, and he went to the WWF. He had a really tremendous debut helping Taz at Unforgiven 2000. It wasn't very hard to see after that, though, that the WWF didn't have any major plans for him. He was the WWF Hardcore Champion a record 27 times, but he never really got out of that box. He did have a memorable hardcore match at WrestleMania 17 against Kane and Big Show, But it was only a matter of time before his role got phased down. He even attempted to change his look to please management by wearing a kilt, having dreads, and putting paint on his face. He was then relegated to Sunday Night Heat for many months. When one of his last appearances on Raw, he was helping The Undertaker attack Jeff Hardy, and then he was gone from the company. He went on to TNA to become the NWA TNA champion, did many shots in Ring of Honor, and still works the independent sometimes today. It's really a shame because you'll be hard-pressed to find anybody that could work as good as Raven in the ring, as well as understand the mindset of how to get over and get the fans behind you or to get them to hate you. He is one of the few heels in wrestling that managed to consistently keep his heat the entire time that he was a heel. But Raven has admitted that he burned a lot of bridges over his career, and he had a lot of substance abuse issues. He was very instrumental in the creation of a lot of ECW characters, and really had one of the greatest minds of the business. I have no doubt that if he would have actually been given the ball by either WWF or WCW, he could have had numerous successful runs as the world champion. It didn't matter if it was an opening match, the hardcore style, or main event style, Raven could do it all. He is often forgotten or overlooked by many fans, and he has his critics, but I encourage everybody to go check out some of his matches on the WWE Network and listen to some of his promos, and you will be amazed by the talent that is Scott Levy.
And new World Heavyweight Champion,
Number 10. The Loose Cannon, Brian Pillman. Formerly known as Flying Brian Pillman, Pillman spent many years in the NWA and WCW. He was the first WCW Light Heavyweight Champion, and was part of one of the greatest tag teams in WCW history, the Hollywood Blondes, with Stunning Steve Austin. He was also a member of the legendary Four Horsemen. Brian reinvented himself with the Loose Cannon character, which played on the psychology of not just the fans, but also management and the other wrestlers. One time Brian touched Bobby Heenan's jacket and got him to drop an F-bomb right on air. And he was part of the infamous Booker Man promo with Kevin Sullivan, which fooled a lot of people into thinking there was tension between him and WCW. Brian subsequently left WCW and was in ECW for a very short period of time. Unfortunately, Brian had an accident where he had to have his ankle fused together. And this really impacted Brian's career, because soon after he made his debut in the WWF, but he could no longer do a lot of the aerial maneuvers that he had been known for. Because a lot of people don't remember that in the States, Brian was doing things off the top rope that most people didn't even dream of back in the day. And because of this, he repeatedly had to take time off because of his injury. This forced Brian to do a lot of color commentary, as well as taking a background role in the legendary stable, the Hart Foundation. Brian's injury led to a memorable angle where Steve Austin took Brian's leg and he crushed it with a steel chair, which then moved on to one of the most controversial angles, which was the Pillman gun angle, which had the entire wrestling world as well as the mainstream media talking. Because, of course, many different watchdog groups and censor boards were not very happy with this presentation. Because of this injury, we lost out on a lot of dream matches because not many people could go like Brian Pillman. He could have had great matches with guys like Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, and Owen Hart. They would have been for sure classics that we would all remember. We often talk about Austin and Rock or Austin and McMahon, but if Brian hadn't been injured, we probably would have been talking about Austin Pillman, because the Loose Cannon character was similar to the Stone Cold character before there even was such a thing, and Steve Austin would tell you that Brian Pillman had a major impact on his career. That rivalry of those two feuding as well as teaming up and feuding again could have went on for years. But even with the injury, Brian's promo skills were second to none, and his understanding about how the business works and how to work to people is something that some wrestlers will never accomplish. Unfortunately, on October 5th, 1997, Brian Pillman was found dead in his motel room. He apparently died of a form of heart disease that had also killed his father. So it is possible without the injury that Brian could have been a world champion, but he probably wouldn't have been able to carry the workload, so I would really fault the injury more than anything as to why he wasn't. But his life was definitely cut way too short, and we lost one of the most inventive, influential, and creative wrestlers that day. There is very few people that you can point to and say they revolutionized the business, but Brian Pillman is one of them, and he probably would have been one of the greatest heel world champions of all time. Number 9. The Honky Tonk Man. Wayne Ferris, also known as the Honky Tonk Man, was not only the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time, but he was the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time as voted on by the fans at WWE.com. And during the time that he was Intercontinental Champion, It was known as the Workhorse title. The Honky Tonk Man was one of the most memorable characters of the 80s and 90s. He was consistently able to generate and maintain heat. He was also a very good worker, and he knew how to connect with the crowd. What made Honky Tonk Man such a great champion was his promo skills. He talked like he was the greatest thing on God's green earth, but everybody in the crowd and everybody at home thought they could kick his ass. So people would pay money to go to arenas to see Honky Tonk Man get his ass kicked. But no matter what, whether he won by cheating or he lost the match by disqualification or countout, he was able to keep his championship, and that incensed people and made them want to come back and see him get his ass kicked again. Now, the Honky Tonk Man has had his critics over the years, such as Eric Bischoff, Ric Flair, as well as many others, and they're all entitled to their opinion. But you have to understand how the WWF business model was back in those days. Because you see, the WWF would run A, B, and C shows, A shows being headlined by Hulk Hogan, and C shows being small places like high school gyms and armories, and then there was the B shows, usually headlined by the Intercontinental Champion, which usually were around 5,000 seat arenas. Sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, give or take which arena it actually was. And Honky Tonk Man had consistent sellouts against guys like Randy Savage or Brutus Beefcake. Even when he dropped the title to the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam, he was still main eventing against Warrior in return matches for several months after the fact. Also, and this will come up more later, the WWF, when it came to the World Champion, was traditionally a babyface territory, in other words, a good guy, that would be an ethnic champion that the people could get behind, and they would defeat heels over and over again. Versus in territories like the NWA and other places, most of them had heel or bad guy world champions that the babyface would chase and get screwed and then try to overcome. With all that in mind, Honky Tonk Man was part of Jimmy Hart's stable, and if Vince McMahon would have wanted to, if he would have screwed either Hogan or Savage out of the title and put it on the Honky Tonk Man, and I believe that he could have replicated the same success that he had with the Intercontinental Championship with the World Championship. Most likely for the same amount of time, if not longer. Had the Honky Tonk Man gone to Jim Crockett Promotions or some other territory, he could have easily had this kind of a run. And if that would have happened, we might not just be saying that the Honky Tonk Man was the greatest Intercontinental Champion of all time, but we might actually be saying he was the greatest World Champion of all time.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 8. Goldust. The bizarre one, Goldust, actually had quite an accomplished career as the natural Dustin Rhodes in WCW, most notably being a former United States champion. But in August of 1995, he debuted as the bizarre one, Goldust, a character from Hollywood who would use mind games and flirtatious advances against his opponents. He was said to be androgynous. There are a lot of heels on this list that got a lot of heat, but Goldust got white-hot heat. And when I say white-hot heat, I mean the kind of heat where people are yelling all kinds of slurs at him and wanting to kill him. Now that's a real heel right there. In his runs throughout the WWE, he has captured numerous tag team championships, but most notably he has been a 3-time Intercontinental Champion, and he has feuded with the top stars of the company over the last several decades. In his first couple years, he had a notable feud over the WWF Championship with Shawn Michaels, and he looked like he was going to be on the fast track to becoming the world champion, because it's very rare that you have a memorable character that's just ahead of its time like a Goldust. Unfortunately for Goldust, there was a lot of pushback from the LGBT community because they didn't like some of the mannerisms that Goldust was portraying on television. Even though I would argue if you look up the word androgynous, it doesn't say anything about homosexuality, and they never really said one way or another what kind of persuasion he was. After all, he did have his wife, Marlena, at ringside with him. So after the complaints, Vince McMahon pulled back on the character, and sometimes Goldust would still go a little too far and it would get him in trouble. He also had some substance abuse issues, and he had a divorce from his wife. Goldust has been fired, and he quit the company, and he's come back numerous times. In his most recent return, he won the tag titles with his brother Cody, and he has been with the company ever since. Matter of fact, he looks like he's in the best shape he's ever been in his entire life. Now, I'm not saying that Goldust will never be the world champion, but at this stage it's very unlikely. However, you can never say never. If he never does become the world champion, I will often look back at the year 1996 and think to myself that they should have went ahead and pushed the envelope, and they should have made Goldust a champion. He's a bona fide main eventer who worked well with The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart, Steve Austin, you name it, he worked with them. I really just think Goldust was a victim of being ahead of his time, because you have to remember, it was the mid-90s, and the world was a lot different of a place. What's amazing is his father, Dusty Rhodes, was a world champion, and while he was one of the greatest wrestlers that ever lived, to the modern millennial generation, Goldust is actually a more well-known wrestler, and it's a shame he just never got the run that he deserved.
And new World Heavyweight Champion,
Number 7. Jake the Snake Roberts. Jake Roberts was a master tactician in the ring. He was the inventor of the DDT, which today is used as a high spot, but at the time was considered one of the most devastating finishing maneuvers in the business. Jake Roberts was a master of ring psychology, and during his promos he would speak very softly, and you couldn't help but be captivated and mesmerized by every little word that he said. When he was a good guy, a lot of people remember him using his Python Damien against his fallen opponents. And when he was a heel, he was one of the nastiest heels in the business. Most people remember one of the most infamous segments in WWE history, where he tied up the Macho Man Randy Savage in the ropes, and he pulled his King Cobra out of the bag, and the Cobra bit Randy in the arm. Everything Jake did was smooth and looked like it took little to no effort, because he was just that damn good. The problem was Jake was too good. He was going to start a feud with Hulk Hogan, but once he DDT'd him, the crowd erupted, and they started chanting DDT. And of course the WWF was not going to let their cash cow Hulk Hogan look bad, so Jake's program was cut short. Now Jake had a lot of personal demons in his life, and it's been well documented in the movie The Resurrection of Jake the Snake, which I highly recommend to anybody who hasn't seen it. And Jake will tell you he upset a lot of people, and he burned a lot of bridges multiple times. He left for a very short time to WCW, where he main evented against Sting, but had a falling out with them over money. Jake never even got to be the Intercontinental Champion or hold any kind of major secondary titles in either one of the promotions. He's often said to be one of the most creative minds in the business, and he really has contributed a lot over the years. It's just an unfortunate circumstance that the biggest enemy to Jake the Snake Roberts was himself. Perhaps if Jake had came up in a different time and could have handled life on the road a little better, he may have got that opportunity to be one of the greatest world champions of all time. Number 6. Jerry the King Lawler. Jerry the King Lawler, often thought of by modern fans as the announcer guy. And don't get me wrong, Jerry Lawler is a great announcer. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Jerry the King Lawler is considered to be one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. He's even been called as such by people like Jim Cornette, Lance Storm, Raven, and even Nick Bockwinkel. Jerry Lawler still wrestles today, but he actually started his wrestling career in 1970. Many people have a lot of sellout records, but Jerry the King Lawler was selling out the Mid-South Coliseum for years, and that's a 10,000-seat arena. And I would defy you to find any WWE wrestler today that could go to the same place every month and sell it out. Jerry was part of one of the most legendary feuds in wrestling with Andy Kaufman. This garnered a lot of mainstream attention, and it even spilled over on Late Night with David Letterman. And this is long before the Rock and Wrestling Connection. If you ever go back and watch any of the Memphis Wrestling, Jerry Lawler would get some of the loudest pops in wrestling history. When Jerry was a heel, he could be one of the nastiest heels, and he knew how to get a rise out of people. And when Jerry was a babyface, nobody can fire up and get the crowd behind him like Jerry can. It really doesn't matter what match you watch of Jerry Lawler's, whether it is in WWE or if you go back and watch Jerry in his prime. His work rate is second to none. He does everything like it's just an afterthought. It looks smooth, it looks easy, and that's because Jerry is a natural. Jerry is often called the King of Memphis because he truly is. Now, he did have some notable feuds in the WWE, such as with Bret Hart or the Ultimate Warrior. In 2010, he started a feud with The Miz over the WWE Championship, and there was serious consideration to putting the title on him at that time. And for whatever reason, they changed their mind about it, but I really wish they would have done it. Because from what I understand, the plan was he would win the title and he would lose it back to Miz at the next pay-per-view. And I think it would have made Miz a better champion if he would have got to work with Lawler for a longer period of time. And it would have got him a second title reign under his belt. All that aside, Jerry deserved to win the WWE Championship. As I said about Arn Anderson early on in this video, if there's any young wrestlers out there, they should really take time to study Jerry Lawler in everything he does, whether it's in-ring work, promo skills, commentary, or just how he reacts to a crowd, whether he's being a heel or a babyface. Not many wrestlers have the experience or the capability that Jerry Lawler does. And he wasn't the best looking athlete of all time, but he was just a natural at professional wrestling. Just like when he was the AWA World Champion, if he would have ever got the opportunity to be the WWE Champion, he would have definitively been one of the greatest champions of all time.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 5. The British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith. The British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith was fondly remembered for being part of one of the greatest tag teams in WWF history in the early 80s, the British Bulldogs, with his partner Dynamite Kid. After subsequently leaving the company, he came back in the early 90s. A lot of people remember this run because Davey headlined SummerSlam 92 with Bret the Hitman Hart over the Intercontinental Championship, where he won the belt in the main event in Wembley Stadium to a roaring crowd. It was unheard of in the 90s for a Intercontinental Championship match to headline a pay-per-view over a World Championship match, especially when the guys that were in the World Championship match were the Ultimate Warrior and the Macho Man Randy Savage. Davey Boy left the company not too long afterwards, and he ended up in WCW, where he feuded with Vader over the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. He even won the championship on a tour of England, but the decision was reversed. I personally feel this was a big mistake on WCW's part. When you look at this period in WCW, the ratings were horrible, and if nothing else, they should have tried to build their company around Davey, and they could have had a big portion of the market share over there in the UK. But over money and creative differences, Davey Boy left WCW. Then he came back to probably what was his best run in the WWE. He became the first European champion. He had a very memorable tag team title reign with his brother-in-law Owen Hart, and he was part of the legendary stable the Hart Foundation. But the reason that I point to this particular time is Davey Boy headlined numerous pay-per-views for the WWF Championship against the likes of Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Big Daddy Cool Diesel. At the Beware of Dog pay-per-view, just like in WCW, he won the championship and was declared the winner over Shawn Michaels, but the decision was overturned. For whatever reason, no matter which company, they would just never pull the trigger on the British Bulldog. The thing of it is, he wrestled Bret and Shawn quite a bit throughout his entire career, and I would argue he was just as good as both of them as far as his in-ring work goes. He was a big guy, but he could work with much bigger guys as well as smaller guys. And when Davey was on point, he was on point. He had decent promo skills, he could captivate an audience, and he would have been a believable world champion. Unfortunately, he did have his demons, and if you read Bret's book, he talks about Davey doing a lot of drugs. When he left the WWE the third time and went to WCW, he was slammed on a trapdoor and he got a serious back injury. He came back to the WWE again, but he never was quite the same, and unfortunately, in May 2002, Davey Boy passed away. It's just a shame because Davey had all the tools to be the World Heavyweight Champion. Vince McMahon supposedly likes big guys. There was not a lot of guys who were stronger than Davey. And again, his ring work was solid. He could have been the first Englishman to be a world champion, and regardless if it would have been for WCW or the WWF, I guarantee you the money they could have made in the UK market would have went up exponentially. He was one of the best workers of his generation, whether you were talking about a singles or a tag team wrestler. And he was probably the most famous wrestler to come out of England, at least internationally, to a mainstream audience. William Regal being a short second. Personal problems, wrong place, wrong time, or just a combination of all the above. It's a shame that the British Bulldog never got to make his mark as the World Heavyweight Champion.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 4. Scott Hall. Scott Hall's early days in the AWA being known as Big Scott Hall, he was touted as being the second coming of Hulk Hogan. When he made his debut in the WWF as the character Razor Ramon, he was quickly plugged into the main event scene. He worked with all the big stars, like Randy Savage, Bret the Hitman Hart, Yokozuna, Vader, and stole the show at WrestleMania 10 with the first ever televised WWF ladder match. He was the first 4-time Intercontinental Champion. His ring work was second to none. He had some of the greatest promo skills. It didn't matter if he was a bad guy or a good guy. People either loved him or they hated him. Anytime during his initial WWF run, he could have been the world champion and people would have accepted it. because he was believable and he knew how to carry the load. In 1996, he jumped over to WCW for greener pastures, for more money, as well as less dates. When he did this, he impacted the business in a way which it would never be the same again. First, in the fact that he had a guaranteed contract, and WWE was forced to change the way that they did business. He also helped form the NWO with Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan, which has tried to be duplicated many times but to minimal success. If you weren't alive back then, you have no idea how much this impacted the entire wrestling industry, as people are still throwing up too sweet signs today. He had a hell of a run in WCW. He held the tag team championships multiple times with Kevin Nash as the Outsiders. At one time, he was the television champion and the United States champion. He even won the World War III Battle Royal, which guarantees the winner a title shot at the World Championship. Much like Jake Roberts, though, Scott Hall had a lot of personal demons and problems with drugs and alcohol, and it plagued his career even into his second WWE run, which was very short. When Scott was in the right frame of mind, there was nobody better. He is one of the few members of the Clique that did not win the world title, but he helped get a lot of the guys he worked with to the place that they are now. I do somewhat feel that WCW missed an opportunity with him. At any time during his run there, he could have been the world champion, and he most likely would have been a great one. I think it's just a case of his own personal demons getting in the way of his success. Plus, Scott has said in numerous interviews he never cared so much about being the champion as he cared about how much money he made. So that also could have been a factor as to why he was never the world champion. Either way, it's a shame because a guy that was touted as the second coming of Hogan should definitely have been a world heavyweight champion.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 3. Mr. Perfect. Curt Hennig, the former AWA World Champion, made a huge splash when he entered the WWF as Mr. Perfect. Considered to be one of the greatest Intercontinental Champions of all time, Mr. Perfect's in-ring work was second to none. People often talk about Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, which we have numerous times in this video. Both of them will tell you that Mr. Perfect is the greatest in-ring worker of all time. If you go back and watch any of his matches, nobody else could bump like Mr. Perfect. He ended up having a serious back injury in 1991, and if you watch his match at SummerSlam 91 against Bret Hart where he dropped the championship, despite the injury, he still managed to put on an incredible performance, and I would go as far as to say that there are a lot of guys in the business today that probably couldn't even have that good of a match without an injury. His promo skills were top-notch, his commentary skills were excellent, pretty much everything Mr. Perfect did was, well, perfect. When he started his WWF run, he had an undefeated streak and started a feud with the champion Hulk Hogan, and he got numerous victories by disqualification against Hulk Hogan, which even a disqualification victory against Hogan was a big deal back at that time. He was really just an unfortunate victim of circumstance when it comes to the babyface territory mentality, since the majority of Perfect's run was as a heel, mainly because he came up during the Hogan Warrior time period, and there just never was that opportunity to put the championship on him, at least not at that time. Plus, the injury kept him out of action for a short period of time, but he had notable major matches in the WWE, including a Loser Leaves Town match in which he defeated Ric Flair. He left the WWF at the end of 1996, which I feel this was a missed opportunity. If he had stayed in the WWF, perhaps he would have had a world championship run, but it's very odd to me that during the time period that he was there, that he was never given the opportunity to run with the belt. He emerged in WCW in 1997, which he notably won the United States Championship. He renewed his rivalry with a lot of the top stars there, wrestling guys like Ric Flair, Bret Hart, as well as beating DDP several times, and in the case of the first two were former world champions, and in the case of DDP would go on to be the world champion. Again, it was an opportunity for WCW to put the world title on a world-class athlete like a Curt Hennig, but they just never pulled the trigger on it. I'm not even sure if he ever had a proper feud for the WCW championship. And as Gorilla Monsoon would say, it's just a miscarriage of justice. He returned to the WWF at the 2002 Royal Rumble and got a huge reaction, and it appeared that he was going to start a feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin, which again could have been an opportunity for WWE to pull the trigger on Mr. Perfect. But he wasn't in the company too long, and he unfortunately passed away in February of 2003. The legacy of Mr. Perfect lives on. You can see it in a lot of superstars today. Every person he ever worked with, he influenced their career, and they were better wrestlers for having been in the ring with him. And you can look at wrestlers like Dolph Ziggler today, and you could see the influence of Mr. Perfect. He had the skills, he had the look, he had the athleticism, the believability, as well as the in-ring work to be the world champion. I just personally think the combination of being in a babyface territory, having an injury that derailed his career for at least a year or so, and just never getting that opportunity to run with the ball even though he severely deserved it, is just a travesty of justice. He was a great AWA world champion, and if he would have gotten the opportunity, he would have been a perfect WCW or WWE World Heavyweight Champion.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
Number 2, the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. Ted DiBiase started his career in 1974. In 1981, there was serious consideration to making Ted DiBiase the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. But because of NWA politics at the time, this never actually happened. And it was probably a missed opportunity on their part. He worked the territories in Japan, and in 1987 he was in the World Wrestling Federation as the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. Now, the $1 Million Man was not only one of the most memorable characters for his catchphrase, "Everybody has a price," but he was also one of the most hated heels at the end of the 80s and the early 90s. Many people remember the basketball segment where he offered the young child $500 for dribbling the basketball 15 times, and on the 14th time he kicked it right out of his hand. You talk about some crowd heat, not many people can get heat like that. Many people remember the most highest rated segment in wrestling history. On February 5th, 1988, on WWF Main Event, the rematch of Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan, which had two twin referees, and they screwed Hogan out of the title. After Andre won the championship, he surrendered the title to Ted DiBiase. Now, the title was taken away from DiBiase as you cannot buy the World Wrestling Federation Championship. But that didn't happen immediately. He actually went around the house show loop defending the WWF Championship. And I feel this was a huge missed opportunity by the World Wrestling Federation, because Macho Man beat DiBiase at the end of the World Title Tournament at WrestleMania 4. So they might as well have just left it on DiBiase for those couple months and had him drop the belt to Randy Savage anyway. Also, the rumor is that he was slated to win the championship at WrestleMania 4 at the tournament. So the story goes that at the Saturday night's main event, Honky Tonk Man was supposed to drop the Intercontinental title to Randy Savage, but he refused to do so and threatened to go to Jim Crockett Promotions. So Vince McMahon agreed to keep the title on Honky, and in order to appease Randy Savage, told him that they were going to make him the world champion at WrestleMania 4. Now, Bruce Pritchard on Something to Wrestle With has said that Ted DiBiase was considered to be the world champion, but was never actually promised. So it all depends on what you believe. The fact is, we were still in the babyface territory time period, so even if DiBiase would have won the belt at WrestleMania 4, it would have been a miracle if he would have even made it to SummerSlam, but I really feel that they could have done this because they could have just dropped the belt to Randy Savage or Hogan at the following SummerSlam. If he had won the championship, though, he most likely would have lost it a month or two later, and it's a real shame that he never got to be the champion. To make up for this, they made him the $1 Million Champion, which is something that a lot of people remember. And while he never actually was the world champion, he did live the life of a world champion, riding around in limos and staying at 5-star hotels, because that was part of his gimmick. Now, people think this babyface territory mentality is not a real thing, but the last time before this that a heel had a championship for an extended period of time was Superstar Billy Graham in 1977 for 9 months. And we wouldn't have a long heel championship reign till Yokozuna's second reign in 1994. I think a lot of the younger fans just don't realize what a ring general that Ted DiBiase was. Everything he did in the ring looked good. Even without being the champion, he was remembered as one of the greatest heels of the 80s. Before that, in his territory days, people often remember Ted DiBiase for his excellent ring work. Now, Ted DiBiase did go on to have a good career. He had a couple tag team title runs with Irwin R. Shyster, the IRS, as part of Money Incorporated. But throughout the late 80s and early 90s, he feuded with all the world champions, Randy Savage, Ultimate Warrior, Hulk Hogan, and I feel at any time they could have pulled the trigger on him. In the beginning of 91, they put the belt in Sergeant Slaughter, and Sergeant Slaughter absolutely deserved to be the world champion. But a lot of that decision had to do with the Iraq War at the time. If those hostilities hadn't been going on, I often think to myself somebody like Rick Rude or Ted DiBiase could have easily filled that role. Due to some neck injuries, Ted DiBiase had to retire. He was still active and doing different roles in wrestling for a while, but he never got back in the ring again. There is nobody more evident of being in the wrong place at the wrong time than Ted DiBiase as far as being in the babyface territory. He had the ring skills, he had the mic skills, he had all the tools to be a great world champion. Luckily, he did get to spend the majority of his WWF career being treated like a world champion. But if he would have ever got the ball, he probably would have been remembered as one of the greatest champions of all time.
And new World Heavyweight Champion!
And the number one wrestler that should have been a world champion is the Hot Rod, Rowdy Roddy Piper. Rowdy Piper is considered to be one of the greatest heels of all time. I talked about white hot heat earlier. Nobody could get white hot heat like Rowdy Piper. He often had to fight fans on his way out of the arena because they hated him so much. He was once even stabbed by a fan. He was one of the greatest talkers of all time. A lot of people remember him for his Piper's Pit segments. This is a revolutionary talk show format that has been copied and duplicated to the point that it's ridiculous over and over again, but they never could capture the success of Piper's Pit. A lot of people remember Piper smashing a coconut across Jimmy Snuka's head, and wrestlers like CM Punk were inspired to get into wrestling because of this segment. Piper was a great worker, but it was his personality that outshined everybody else. He portrayed himself as tough, and he was, and you believed it. And he also would do anything to protect the business. He once famously told Hulk Hogan in a segment on Nitro, "They wouldn't have loved you so much if they didn't hate me so bad." And he's absolutely right. Before WrestleMania, there was the war to settle the score. The feud he had with Hogan was one of the most heated feuds in wrestling. He even kicked Cyndi Lauper in the head. He was part of the main event of the first WrestleMania opposite of Hogan. The accolades and accomplishments just in that part of his career makes him way more than qualified to be a world champion. Piper is one of the few people during this time period that Hogan never got a victory over. At least not in the middle of the ring. And honestly, they probably should have flipped the belt back and forth between them a few times. Hogan once told Piper if he would have done a job for him, he probably would have flipped the belt back and forth between them. But that would have been Vince's call, and you gotta take everything Hogan says with a grain of salt. Piper's second run in WWF was as a babyface, and he could get the crowd behind him like nobody else. He had a memorable Intercontinental title reign where he stole the show with Bret Hart at WrestleMania 8 when he dropped the title to him. Now, Piper would go on to WCW, and WCW dropped the ball again. At Halloween Havoc 1997, Rowdy Piper beat Hulk Hogan in a cage match in the main event, but he did not win the championship. My friends and I thought that he was the new world champion. In fact, a lot of people thought he was the new world champion. We were all surprised on Nitro to find out that he wasn't. Apparently, this was a non-title match. They never said it was a title match, but they didn't say it wasn't. And that's just the stupidity of WCW right there. When you have your world champion in the main event of a pay-per-view against another guy in a cage match, it should be for the world championship. This is one of the hugest blunders that I look back on, because Piper should have got the belt. Even if he would have only got the title for a month. The fans were behind him. He beat your champion. It wasn't a Nitro. It wasn't a house show. It was a pay-per-view. I feel there was a lot of politics and other things going on, and he was robbed of that opportunity. Now, don't get me wrong, Piper never needed the world championship. He wrestled Hogan, Flair, and all kinds of other big stars around the country in main events. He didn't need the title, but he would have liked to have had that feather in his cap, and he would have liked the money that came along with it. Now, for any newer fans that are watching this, you need to understand how important Piper was to the overall business. To understand that, you need to understand Hulk Hogan. Hulkamania and the phenomenon that it was is in part majorly responsible for the way that wrestling is today, for better or worse. And to understand that, we need to understand who made Hulkamania what it is, besides Hulk Hogan. Obviously, being in the AWA run by Verne Gagne and being in a Rocky movie helped get it started. Winning the championship from the Iron Sheik and the tensions with Iran launched Hogan into a stratosphere. Vince McMahon and Hogan's vision of how the character should go. Hogan slamming Andre at WrestleMania 3, making him a legend. But when you look in between the time of the Sheik and Andre, while Hogan had a lot of opponents, there was none more hated and more hotter than Rowdy Piper. So in my opinion, Piper is partially responsible for how the business is today. And there were a lot of guys on this list, and there's a lot of guys that a lot of other people feel should have been world champions. But in my personal opinion, nobody was more deserving to be a world champion than Rowdy Roddy Piper. Well guys, that's my list. Do you guys agree with it, or do you think that some other people should have been on the list? Let me know in the comments down below. I didn't have an honorable mention section because I don't do honorable mentions in these lists, but if I was to think of everybody that should be a world champion, this would easily be a top 50 list. If this video gets a lot of hits and a lot of response, I'll consider doing a part 2 in the future. Stay tuned for the final segment after the credits. And with that being said, thank you guys for watching the Derek Ruby Show. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, as this is the second longest video I have ever done. But you guys wanted it, and I would do anything for my viewers. So you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and Instagram. And as always, have a good one, and I'll see you guys next time. All these great people on this list, and yet the actor David Arquette and Vince Russo were world champions. Now, I don't fault David Arquette because he didn't lobby to be the world champion, but Vince Russo's excuse for being the world champion is that Vince McMahon was. Well, Vince Russo, you're no Vince McMahon, but McMahon's title reign made sense for the story he was trying to tell. Your title reign was nothing more than an ego trip because nobody knew who the hell you were. And you also are the one that put the belt on David Arquette. So both those title reigns are your fault, and people wonder why a company like WCW went out of business.